Hello and welcome back to Podfinder. My name is Philip, and I'm here to talk about Pathfinder 2nd Edition. Today's video is the 6th in the Merry Little SinMas, my sequel series to last year's 12 Days of SinMas. And if you don't know what that means, I suggest checking out the playlist in the description. Basically, over a 7-week period, I'm covering the story of the Runelords of Thassilon in the Age of Lost Omens, preparing players and GMs for Revenge of the Runelords. Today, I'm getting back to my SinMas roots by examining the evolving lore in the nation of Thassilon. Though today I'll be discussing New Thassilon rather than Ancient Thassilon. In the years since the conclusion of the Return of the Runelords adventure path, a new nation has risen to power in the northern reaches of Varisia, and the arcane might of the ancient Runelords has reasserted itself as a major player in global politics. On top of that, a number of other lore topics relating to Thassilon, both ancient and new, have evolved since I concluded the 12 Days of SinMas last year. So this video will also function as a full-on lore update, reviewing all the new information revealed in Divine Mysteries, War of Immortals, Rival Academies, and the 7 Dooms for Sandpoint adventure path. Before that, though, if you enjoy this video and want to hear more Pathfinder lore, consider subscribing or commenting below. Or, if you want to support the channel, check out my Patreon. Just $2 a month gets you access to all my scripts, as well as the audio files for all my videos, all of which drop at least a week early. Let me begin with something which should be obvious. Spoiler alert. This video actively spoils the end of the Return of the Runelords adventure path. I will discuss the state of the world at that campaign's conclusion, as well as the impacts of that campaign on the Saga lands more broadly. Do not watch this video if you intend to play in that campaign and wish to remain spoiler-free. Additionally, the final chapter in this video will spoil an element of the 7 Dooms for Sandpoint AP. I will reissue the spoiler warning when I get there, so you can click off of this video if you want to avoid those specific spoilers. Additionally, this video, and the others in this series, assumes you've seen my 12 Days of SinMas series. I will be assuming a basic knowledge of the material covered in those videos, mainly to avoid retreading any ground I've already covered. Alright, with that out of the way, let's dig in. The Rise of New Thassilon. After the events of the Return of the Runelords adventure path, 2 Runelords from the days of ancient Thassilon, Sorshen and Belimarius, returned to activity on Golarion. Sorshen had emerged from her rune well beneath the Grand Mastaba in Korvosa, and took indirect action to undermine the efforts of Alasnist. Belimarius, meanwhile, had been trapped in the Crystalline, and was released into the Age of Lost Omens when the temporal heroes destroyed her faulty rune well of envy. Upon their emergence onto the world stage, both Runelords quickly took action. They sought to lay claim to new realms, establishing nations where they could rule, as they had done 10,000 years before. Belimarius chose to maintain her base of power in Zin Edasiril. She reasserted control over the city after having either exiled the cults opposing her or having simply driven them underground. From there, she organized her armies and began seizing territory, expanding to both the north and the west. Sorshen chose instead to set herself up in the remains of Zin Shalast, the former seat of power of Karzug, the Runelord of Greed. With her seat of power in the east, Sorshen declared her new nation of Eurythnia to be open to all those seeking redemption and fleeing the mistakes of their past. She is driven in this desire by her faith in Nocticula, the redeemed former demon lord who is now a goddess of art, the night, and redemption. The lands now managed by both Belimarius and Sorshen make up the nation of New Thassilon, which stretches from the border of Belkzen in the east to the Ironbound Isles in the west. North to south, it is sandwiched between Varisia and the lands of the Lenorm Kings and Irisin. Geopolitically, neighbors and visitors are generally forced to negotiate with Sorshen and Belimarius's governments separately. Geopolitically, neighbors and visitors are generally forced to negotiate with Sorshen's and Belimarius's governments separately. Edasseril is more aggressive, where Eurythnia is generally more accepting. So, let's break these two regions down independently. Edasseril, the domain of Belimarius. Immediately upon reasserting her power, Belimarius set to the task of reorganizing and expanding her armies. While her own loyal forces were limited in number at the time of her emergence from the crystalline, she quickly made up for her low numbers with aggressive recruitment efforts. Some of these were simple mercenary recruitments of any soldiers for hire in the region. Other new recruits were forced conscripts, kidnapped and press-ganged into service from among the citizens of Edasseril whom Belimarius perceived as disloyal. The Runelord even began aggressively courting the allegiance of Giant, Zulgath, and Troglodyte clans in and around her home isles. She's even begun offering a bounty on dragon eggs, so she might supplement her forces with loyal draconic servants. Of course, Belimarius was never one to simply look upon the lands of her neighbors and leave them be. Following her envious compulsion, she sent out her armies to conquer the lands around her capital, expanding her territory to the north and the east. This first put her in conflict with Opeer Eightfingers, the Lenorm king of the city of Southmoor. Opeer first provoked Belimarius by raiding her territories, but her retribution was swift and violent. Belimarius crushed the unpopular Lenorm king with her legions of powerful soldiers and wizards. After the battle, Opeer's body was never found, and many speculate that he might be rotting in a cell in Belimarius's palace, while others claim that he is out in the world, seeking loyal followers to reignite his war and reclaim his lost territory. From there, Belimarius continued to expand. She claimed dominion over the Mierani Forest, the elven lands which had evaded the Lords of Envy for centuries during the Thassilonian period. The relatively few elves who made their home in the forest have since taken up arms against their conqueror, unwilling to go quietly into the night. Similarly, in the Ironbound Isles, Belimarius faces harsh opposition from White Estrid, the Lenorm king of Flintreach. White Estrid is far more popular than Opeer had been, and is backed up by numerous powerful warriors and her Lenorm servant Boiltongue. In the hope of avoiding a costly and dangerous war, Belimarius has been plotting some means of assassinating Boiltongue, in the hopes that such an act would nullify White Estrid's claim to the throne of Flintreach. Finally, Belimarius is contesting Sorshen's claim to the Nolans, the flatlands region north of the Mierani Forest occupied by exiles from the nearby Ulfin and Shoanti peoples. More on them in a minute. During all of this, Belimarius herself has remained in her fortress, the Palace Mias Moria. The Runelord of Envy has fully embraced her devotion to the Sin of Envy, and even as her ambition has grown, it has been outstripped by her paranoia. Her immediate focus upon emerging into the Age of Lost Omens was to purge her city of all forms of dissent and opposition, which had spiked in the closing days of Crystalline's isolation. Her crackdown was swift and severe, and her enemies were either captured, killed, or forced to flee or hide. But, to paraphrase Princess Leia, the tighter Belimarius closed her fist, the more enemies and insurgents slipped through her fingers. The undercurrent of rebellion and opposition in Edasseril has only grown in recent years, a fact of which Belimarius has taken notice. Belimarius is haunted by the enemies which surround her, both real and perceived. She blames Sorshen for the rebels in her midst, and contends that external forces are conspiring to undermine her. This fear is in tension with her sense of entitlement to the lands around her. As one of only 2 remaining Runelords, she feels that the whole of Varisia is rightfully hers, especially with Sorshen having abandoned her devotion to Sin. Like a self-fulfilling prophecy, as Belimarius conquers the territories she desires, she draws the ire of increasingly powerful foes. Belimarius's fear and irritation has only been amplified by Vexnil, the ghost of the first girl she killed on her rise to power. Vexnil has been released from the now-destroyed Eye of Jealousy within Belimarius's failed Runewell, and now spends her days undermining the Runelord's power and authority. Likely due to their historical connection, Belimarius has found that her own spells have proven completely ineffective against the capricious ghost. In the Age of Lost Omens, Belimarius is attempting to reassert the rulership style of ancient Thassilon. She embraces tyranny and power, and believes that the world is hers for the taking. This contrasts severely with the worldview of her greatest rival to the east. Eurythnia, the domain of Sorshen. Since her return to activity on Golarion, Sorshen has spent a substantial amount of time interacting with the world and its people. These interactions sparked a long period of self-reflection upon her own life, and she came to the conclusion that her centuries-long indulgence in sin had ultimately proven pointless. Her empire had died with her, and all the power she'd collected had proven incapable of preserving her many accomplishments. At the same time, the failed attempts by Kar-Zug and Alasnist to return to power threw into stark relief the retribution which a wicked life invited, and Sorshen came to the conclusion that, in order to survive in this new world, and in order to find fulfillment as a person, she would need to evolve and change. Sorshen immediately freed her many bound thralls, and gathered up her most valued and powerful possessions and artifacts and hid them within the Eye of Desire. She abandoned Korvosa, the site of her old capital, and relocated to Zin Shalast, the former home of Kar-Zug. She began clearing out the city of dangers, establishing her domain over the region, and putting out the call to subjects. Unlike her previous attempts at rulership, Sorshen had embraced a far lighter touch to influence and control. She encourages a degree of freedom and self-determination among her subjects. She's abandoned the title of Runelord entirely, and instead simply goes by Queen Sorshen. Much of Sorshen's new outlook is derived from her faith in Nocticula, the Redeemer Queen. Nocticula herself is now a goddess of artists and outcasts, and encourages the acceptance of all, especially those who seek to leave behind the mistakes of their past. In this spirit, Sorshen seeks to establish Eurythnia as a land which welcomes all. She built Zin Shalast as a haven for artists, refugees, and exiles, encouraging all those without a home to make their home within her borders. For that reason, Eurythnia, though sparsely populated, is surprisingly diverse. Dragons, Nephilim, Dromar, Lamias, elemental scions, and many others have flocked to the nation's cities. Eurythnia serves as the center of Nocticula's faith on Golarion. Though not a state religion, the faith of the Redeemer Queen has an outsized influence on the culture, economy, and politics of the kingdom. Followers of Nocticula are numerous and fervent, and her cultural and benevolent edicts lead to a generally helpful and accepting national attitude. The Kingdom of Eurythnia has a thriving artistic culture, with radical and bold public art displays, schools for all manner of artistic pursuits, and Nocticulan priests who can even bring works of art to life. As a ruler, Sorshen is tremendously personable. She regularly interacts directly with her people, attending art galleries, directly receiving refugees and visitors, engaging in public displays of music or debate, and regularly attending festivals for her own enjoyment. What few realize, however, is the extent to which she employs blood simulacra to attend these events in her place. This simple safety precaution is a secret which Sorshen guards carefully, but it allows for a huge amount of face time with her people. Sorshen is known to collect adventurers who prove themselves useful to her, providing patronage to those she deems worthy. She generally assigns initial tasks to prospective agents based on the type of work she thinks they might be good at. This might include the gathering of rare ingredients for her own crafting projects, the capturing or taming of wild animals, or the successful hosting of a large social function. While the actual skills and talents being tested during these trials are important, equally important is the subject's willingness to undertake the trial, and the respectfulness and decorum with which they conduct themselves throughout the process. Those who earn the Queen's favor are quick to find steady employment in Zin Shalast, as much of the city still needs to be reclaimed, and many threats need to be dealt with before Sorshen's new kingdom is fully stable. Politically, Sorshen's goal is to establish Eurythnia as a land for those in need of a home. She has actively sought peace with her neighbors and avoids taking an aggressive stance whenever possible. That said, she's still one of the most powerful wizards on the planet, and her most peaceful inclinations should not be taken as a sign of weakness. Internally, Sorshen is generally well-liked and popular, though a select few of her citizens believe that in abandoning her devotion to sin, Sorshen has weakened herself, or at least given up any right to rule in Thassilon. This opinion, however, is very much in the minority. Internationally, Sorshen is generally on good terms with the leaders of the Varisian city-states. Having abandoned any claim to Korvosa, she got off on a good start with the modern leaders of that city, like Queen Cressida Croft. Sorshen has also cultivated a good working relationship with Sheila Hydemarch and the Sahedron Council in Magnamar. She's offered to cooperate with their ongoing research into ancient Thassilon in exchange for their services in recovering her lost artifacts in the remains of Old Eurythnia. To the north, Sorshen has, thus far, failed to make a meaningful alliance with the Witches of Irisen and their queen, Anastasia. Her efforts are being undermined by Baba Yaga, the mighty Mother of Witches, one of the few spellcasters who can stand up to Sorshen with impunity. While Sorshen hasn't yet been able to prove any direct involvement by the witch, a suspicious number of unseasonable blizzards have struck northern New Thassilon in recent years. To the east, however, the diplomatic situation is far brighter. Ardax the Whitehair, the leader of the Hold of Belkzen, has forged a non-aggression pact with Sorshen, and the pair have met for negotiations many times. One reason for this cooperation might be the significant number of orcs and dromar which have settled in Eurythnia in recent years. These orcs have fled in the face of the threat presented by Tar-Baphon, and Sorshen and her people have largely welcomed them with open arms. In the west, Sorshen has laid claim to the Nolans, the same plains which Belimarius has set her sights upon. Under Sorshen's patronage, the Nolans and the port of Brinewall have become paths for north-south trade between Varisia and the lands of the Lenorm kings, generating tremendous prosperity. Of course, Sorshen's greatest rival, and the most immediate threat to her power, is Belimarius. She correctly recognizes the inherent instability of Belimarius's aggressive expansionism. While confident that she could eliminate the Lesser Runelord at any time, Sorshen is hesitant to intervene directly. She has yet to stand up to Adasaril's armies publicly, assuming that Belimarius will destroy herself before her own involvement is necessary. Still, as Belimarius expands, Sorshen's patience and tolerance is being tested, and it seems like only a matter of time before Sorshen will need to depose and destroy the last of the Runelords. Developments since the Godsrain. When a Chekik killed Gorum, the war god's blood and armor fell upon all of existence. The Godsrain showered divine power upon the world, awakening all manner of powers throughout the universe, from new Nephilim to new sorcerers to exemplars. While Gorum's blood was relatively evenly dispersed and limited in the power it offered, the fragments of his armor, called war shards, were far more powerful and concentrated. While the tension between Sorshen and Belimarius has been high in the years since their return, the Godsrain ratcheted this conflict to a whole new level. Each archwizard sought to claim as many war shards as they could, if for no other reason than to deny them to the other. Among these many powerful artifacts, one war shard stood out as unique and potentially extremely valuable, the Trinity Star. This war shard was first perceived as a falling star rocketing through the skies over the Saga lands. It drew special attention for the three tails which it trailed behind it, one red as blood, one black as night, and one a prismatic rainbow pattern. The Trinity Star crashed somewhere within the northwest Kodor Mountains, but has yet to be found. Both Belimarius and Sorshen have claimed ownership of the war shard, but it's clear that the true owner will be whoever finds it first, priming the pump for a violent confrontation in the coming days. Rumors swirl that Opeer Eightfingers, the Lenorm king which Belimarius ousted from power just a few years ago, is seeking the shard as well, intending to use it to return to power. The Resurgence of Rune Magic. Unsurprisingly, the Rise of New Thassilon has ushered in a resurgence in interest in ancient Thassilonian rune magic. As the people of Zinedasiril emerged into the Age of Lost Omens, they brought with them the knowledge of a world long lost. Their view on magic was grounded in the classical understanding of Thassilonian rune magic, giving even the lay people of the city a fascinating perspective on the arcane, which ignited a new passion among magical scholars on Golarion. At the same time, Sorshen and Belimarius present two masters in their respective fields, the sins of lust and envy. Fascinatingly, these two Runelords maintain strongly contrasting worldviews regarding rune magic and its place in the modern world. Sorshen advocates for an evolution in the understanding of rune magic. She holds that an adherence to sin is what doomed Thassilon, and that these principles must be abandoned if the field is to advance and develop further. By contrast, Belimarius insists that the art of sin magic remains as powerful in the Age of Lost Omens as it ever was. She maintains her hold on the sin of envy, and the authoritarian worldview into which she was raised. These conflicting forces have combined with the newly available knowledge in Varisia and New Thassilon to create a fruitful ground for new and radical scholarship. A whole new crop of wizards have taken up the study of rune magic in recent years, and many have taken up the title of Runelord. Historically, the word Runelord referred specifically to the 7 monarchs of the Thassilonian member states. In modern times, however, many arcanists have begun using the term in a much broader sense, using it to refer to practitioners of Thassilonian rune magic generally. From a mechanical perspective, this is the interpretation intended by the Runelord archetype available to PCs. Your character is not a Runelord in the way Karzug was, but is instead a practitioner of a derived and related field of rune magic. These new Runelords broadly fall within 2 groups, whom I will refer to as the Traditionalists and the Radicals. Please note these are my labels, and are not used in universe. The Traditionalists are the adherents of, unsurprisingly, traditional Thassilonian sin magic. They believe that indulgence in sin is the key to power and knowledge, and that deviation from this adherence is an academic dead end. Many of these Traditionalists have aligned with Belimarius, especially those devoted to the sin of envy. Traditionalists not aligned to envy, however, have generally founded their own organizations, and, much like in ancient Thassilon, these organizations quickly become authoritarian and strictly hierarchical. Regardless of their alignment with Belimarius, most Traditionalists are strictly opposed to Sorshen and her new theories. The most famous and influential of these Traditionalists is a woman named Aethusa, the so-called thrice-born queen. Aethusa is a former denizen of Zin Edasiril, who has claimed to be the reincarnated soul of the 2 previous Runelords Aethusa, the 3rd Runelord of Gluttony and the 6th Runelord of Greed. Aethusa has earned a reputation for both her magical skill and her ambition, but her rise to prominence has drawn the attention of Belimarius. The Runelord of Envy is seeking to capture the upstart Aethusa in a coffin of force, displaying her next to Runelord Ferrandi in her throne room. In contrast to the Traditionalists are the Radicals, the wave of new thinkers following in Sorshen's footsteps and pushing rune magic into new spaces. The Radicals have taken a new view of rune magic, that the knowledge and accomplishments of the ancient Thassilonians provide valuable truths, but are ultimately incomplete and flawed due to the corrupting influence of sin upon the field in ancient times. These Radicals are far more concerned with the academics of rune magic rather than the accumulation of power, putting them in direct opposition to the Traditionalists and Runelord Belimarius. Interestingly, we, the audience, actually get an excellent and insightful peek into the philosophy behind the Radicals' worldview in rival academies. This book does something which I find both entertaining and narratively fascinating. This book is awesome, and it does something which I find both entertaining and narratively fascinating. It draws a clear and deliberate parallel between the modern schools of rune magic in New Thassilon and modern undergraduate and graduate school programs here in the real world. The students of rune magic in this book are framed as enthusiastic undergrads who have varying degrees of understanding of the topics they are studying. They're as interested in throwing cool parties as they are in pushing their academic understanding to new heights. The Radicals insist that the runes are the fundamental building blocks of the universe, and that their usage of these blocks fills the caster with a rush of power and emotion. Where the traditionalists associate the surges with sin, the radicals instead assert that the sins are just as associated with these surges as are the virtues. The idea of virtuosity associated with runes is critiqued as a delusion of Xin, one which Sorshen herself disagrees with. The radicals also differentiate between the idea of runic sin, to the extent that it exists, and the sins associated with the demons of the Outer Rifts, which they insist are far more limited in scope. Interestingly, the radicals place significant importance on the personal rune of each caster. These are runes unique to each person, which evolve and grow over time. This growth reflects the caster's understanding of runes, and the study of specific runic schools, as delineated by the 7 runes of rule, indicate this growth and change by expanding specific fields of understanding. A Runelord of Greed, for instance, might have a personal rune which begins to incorporate elements of the Rune of Greed as they gain a clearer understanding of transmutation magic. In theory, a Runelord whose understanding of runic magic is sufficiently advanced might display a personal rune connected to all 7 runes of rule, or at least all 5 to which they are not excluded, based upon their initial school specialization. One final note on the radicals is their notable dismissal of the idea of additional runes of rule. The 7 runes of rule, these radicals insist, are the fundamental 7 runes, united behind the Sihedron rune. No other foundational runes exist, or could exist. Bear this in mind for the chapter at the end of this video. The Runelords Post-Remaster. Now I need to step away from the lore for a moment and discuss mechanics. With the real-world OGL crisis, in which Paizo was forced to abandon the Legacy 3.5 mechanics and IP, Pathfinder stepped away from the traditional 8 schools of magic which had previously defined all spells in the setting. In many ways, this was a welcome change, since plenty of the spells certainly straddled the borders between schools. With the Runelords, however, this definitely untethered them from their narrative foundations. Historically, the schools of rune magic were the actual mechanical spell schools in the game, meaning the Runelords had a glimpse of the underlying mechanics of the game, the source code, you might say, for the world in which they lived. Now, with the loss of the 8 schools, rune magic must be reinterpreted. We finally got a new look at rune magic in the post-remaster era in Lost Omens Rival Academies earlier this year, and I gotta say, I quite like Paizo's solution to the problem. In short, the fundamental sin runes, now called the Runes of Rule in Universe, still exist, and help to differentiate between spells which are associated with specific sins, virtues, and runic schools. Mechanically, the schools of sin are now delineated in 2 ways, with school curricula and with anathema. School curricula now give you a platonic ideal of the types of spells into which you specialize, while anathema delineate the types of spells you cannot cast, those which would have previously been set by your opposition schools. Each school of sin now also has its own unique focus spell, further adding flavor and definition to the new runic schools. I've already done a detailed discussion of the new Runelord archetype with Jake from Wisdom Check, so check that out if you want my mechanical thoughts on the archetype. That said, I do want to briefly review each of the 7 schools, the spells they provide, and the anathema associated with each. Before we get into individual sin schools, I need to first address the spells available to all Runelords. The Runelord class archetype for wizards is unique in that it gives practitioners access to 2 spell curricula, a universal set of spells and a sin-specific set of spells. The universal set of spells includes a combination of versatile spells, which nearly all wizards will use, and divination spells, which practitioners of rune magic saw as unworthy of specialization. The generally useful spells include things like Detect Magic, Mystic Armor, Runic Weapon and Body, Dark Vision, Fly, and Sending. The divinations include things like Sure Strike, Scrying, True Sight, and Foresight. This relatively small curriculum is supplemented by the sin-specific curricula of each school. Up first, the School of Envy is focused on defensive protection magic, and the dismantling or copying of spells cast by others. Spells like Dispel Magic, Containment, Banishment, Spell Rack, and Quandary make the practitioners of Envy exceptionally skilled at countering other mages. Their anathema states, quote, "Use your magic to cause harm with the elements or the void," unquote. This is largely aligned with the legacy opposition schools of evocation and necromancy, but opens up a few non-traditional spells within those schools, like healing spells from necromancy or the rare defensive spell from evocation. Also, any necromancy schools which only use vitality energy are now fair game. Up next, the School of Gluttony is focused on the manipulation of void energy and the act of consumption and eating. This is a fairly broad categorization and allows for spells from Summon Undead and Ghoulish Cravings to Vampiric Feast, Disintegrate, and Devouring Void. Also, create food, because of course. I could see modern practitioners of Gluttony supplementing their skills with feats from the Necromancer class archetype once it releases. Their anathema states, quote, "Use your magic to protect others or manipulate minds," unquote. This aligns with the legacy opposition schools of enchantment and abjuration, but notably opens up abjuration spells which protect the caster themselves, a significant improvement. The School of Greed focuses on the transformation of matter from one form to another, and the creation of treasure. Spells like Aerial Form, Dragon Form, and Monstrosity Form make greed casters great at engaging in melee with their companions, while spells like Ant Hall, Stone Shape, and Shrink Item provide them with versatility. They even have spells like Lifewood Cage, Chrysopoetic Curse, and Impaling Spike, providing them with more offensive potential than many of the legacy greed wizards had. Their anathema states, quote, "Use your magic to affect the mind or perception, rather than physical reality," unquote. This is basically identical to the legacy opposition schools of enchantment and illusion, and doesn't meaningfully change the limits for their spellcasting. The School of Lust is focused on the manipulation of the mind, from mind reading to planting thoughts, and even controlling the mind directly. This is an extremely versatile set of abilities, as demonstrated by the range of spells, from Dream Message, Suggestion, and Mind Probe to Confusion, Love Sacrifice, and Uncontrollable Dance. The anathema for the School of Lust states, quote, "Use your magic to meddle with physical forms or invoke the void," unquote. The ban on physical forms largely lines up with the legacy opposition school of transmutation. The ban on the void, however, leaves open the possibility of vitality spells, which had previously been excluded due to their association with necromancy. The one thing I would suggest for players considering the School of Lust is to have a conversation with your GM about how strictly they interpret the phrase "meddle with physical forms." An overly strict GM might expand this definition to include summoning spells which conjure physical creatures, so just clarify that before you commit to this character concept. The School of Pride focuses on the manipulation of perception, to the exclusion of manipulating physical reality. Skilled Pride practitioners have the ability to manipulate all 5 senses in their targets. Utility spells like Illusory Disguise, Mirage, and Project Image give them impressive versatility, while spells like Blindness, Mask of Terror, and even Overwhelming Presence give them substantial combat potential. Their anathema states, quote, "Use your magic to create physical things rather than their appearances," unquote. This is a very broadly worded anathema, and I don't really like it. Historically, the opposition schools to Pride were Transmutation and Conjuration. This anathema doesn't do a good job of defining that. For example, is a fireball or lightning bolt a physical thing, according to this anathema? Does teleportation count as changing a physical thing? If so, what about telekinesis? Both move things around, but one is historically conjuration. It's a major plot point that Xandergul, Lord of Illusions, couldn't cast teleportation spells. In my mind, this anathema should probably be reworded to something like, quote, "Use your magic to transform physical forms, to teleport objects, or to create matter," unquote. Next, the School of Sloth focuses on 3 things: the summoning of servant creatures, the transportation of physical objects, and the induction of slothfulness in opponents. This school really got a nice glow-up post-remaster, with the inclusion of spells like Slow, Enfeeble, and Indolent Haze. Other spells like Teleport, Collective Transposition, and Ghostly Carrier provide utility, while Summon Elemental and Summon Dragon provides some nice, if simple, minion calling ability. The anathema for this school states, quote, "Use your magic to manipulate appearances or directly cause harm with the elements." Again, this is largely aligned with the legacy opposition schools of Illusion and Evocation, but does open up the rare defensive legacy evocation spell. Finally, the School of Wrath is focused on blasting, plain and simple. Practitioners of Wrath specialize in channeling their arcane power into rapid and explosive releases of energy, with spells like Force Barrage, Fireball, Lightning Bolt, Disintegrate, and Earthquake. A few thematic spells outside of this categorization have also been added, including Blinding Fury, Blistering Invective, and Fiery Body. The anathema for this school states, quote, "Use your magic to protect or create," unquote. And honestly, I absolutely despise this anathema. Historically, Wrath's opposition schools were Abjuration and Conjuration, which left them extremely vulnerable and dependent on protective allies. The new anathema prevents Wrathcasters from defending themselves with defensive spells, which is fine, while opening up offensive abjurations like Spell Crash, which is also great. The issue I have is how far do the ideas of create and protect actually go? I would think that wall spells would count as creation, but Wall of Ice and Wall of Fire are explicitly included in the school curriculum. If you cast a Fireball spell to drive enemies away from your allies, have you protected them and thus violated your anathema? I don't know what the fix is. The anathema would probably need to be something like, quote, "Use your magic to cast explicitly defensive magic to teleport away from danger or to call allies to your aid," unquote. If you're considering playing a Runelord of Wrath, you really need to have a clarifying discussion with your GM. This one is just way too vague to be workable. For my further thoughts on the remastered Runelord archetype, check out my video with Wisdom Check from a few months back. Link in the description. Now, let's get back to the lore. Lissala. Lissala was the goddess of rune magic in ancient Aslan and Thassilon. During the days of Thassilon, however, Lissala became corrupted by the sinful practices embraced by her followers. Where she had once been a neutral goddess of knowledge and magic, she eventually became a goddess of hierarchy, magic, and obedience. During my video on Lissala last year, I covered her manifestation as the Sihedron Scion, an evil goddess of hierarchy. At the time, there existed no clarification on the specifics of Lissala as the Order of Virtue, her uncorrupted form. Luckily for me, in Divine Mysteries, Paizo presented a new look at Lissala describing her pre-corruption state. So, let's take a look. Lissala, the Order of Virtue, was a goddess of magical discovery and dutiful hard work. She advocated for the 7 classical Thassilonian virtues, but emphasized them as subordinate to the idea of duty, hard work, and obedience to a rightful authority figure. She advocated for the sharing and active spreading of knowledge, and especially magical knowledge. Knowledge, Lissala taught, was free and available to all, and should never be concealed. Lissala encouraged her followers to adhere very strictly to her teachings, believing that order and structure was critical to a good and virtuous existence. This emphasis on the importance of conformity to regulations and edicts is what opened Lissala's church to corruption, as it was poised to evolve into a devotion to hierarchy entirely decoupled from virtue. Even during the Aslanti period, prior to Lissala's corruption, devout Lissalans often craved hierarchy and structure. Their black and white worldview often left them unprepared for a world filled with shades of gray. Lissala, the Order of Virtue's edicts, are to gather and share knowledge freely, to honor your duty when your word is given, and to respect and carry out the law. Note the lack of any edict to examine the inherent fairness of the law. By contrast, to conceal and keep information secret, to break an oath, or to subvert an authority figure are all anathema to Lissala. Again, note the inability to question if an authority figure is actually legitimate. Though this manifestation of Lissala is easily more benign than the explicitly malevolent Sihedron Scion, it's easy to see the potential for corruption and exploitation by bad actors, both inside and outside of the faith. As with the Sihedron Scion, the Order of Virtue's sacred colors are green and gold. Her favored weapon is the whip, and her favored animal is the snake. The Order of Virtue, however, allows for both the harm or heal fonts, and her clerics and champions may choose either holy or unholy sanctification, but are not required to do so. Her domains are ambition, duty, fate, and knowledge, and she has the alternate domain of glyph. Notably, this version of Lissala does not have the domain of magic, which I find very odd. So, why is all of this relevant? Lissala was corrupted during the days of ancient Thassilon, and has largely vanished from the world. Well, if you'll recall from my video on the Year of the Risen Rune a few weeks ago, the cult of Lissala is active again in Avistan. Many of these cultists were clerics, receiving power from their goddess on a scale which hadn't been seen on Golarion for millennia. At the same time, with the appearance of ancient Zin Edasiril in the Age of Lost Omens, hundreds, possibly thousands, of ancient worshippers of Lissala have returned to the world. The interactions between these ancient believers and the modern world are beginning to shed new light upon Lissala and her beliefs, and nowhere is this made clearer than in War of Immortals. War of Immortals, the rulebook introducing the mythic rules, contains a number of interesting stories within the world of Golarion. One of these examines a group of devout Lissalans from Zin Edasiril traveling through the Grungir forest in the land of the Lenorm kings. These devotees, led by a woman named Izalin, explicitly follow the Order of Virtue, the benign aspect of Lissala. They considered her original path to be the true path toward enlightenment and a good society, and her corruption into sin was a simple misinterpretation by her mortal followers. They stood in direct opposition to the followers of the Sihedron Scion, whom they refer to as followers of the Way of the Whip. The goal of these devotees was simple, to restore Lissala to her uncorrupted manifestation. They sought to accomplish this by reaching a site called the Temple of the Seven Wings, a mythical site which hasn't yet been detailed by Paizo. In arriving at this temple, the devotees believed that they would be able to turn Lissala from her sinful ways, and restore her vision of virtuosity. More so, they believed that they had been brought forward in time for the explicit divine purpose of restoring Lissala to the path of righteous divine duty, free of sin. Of course, these radicals were viewed as heretics by the followers of the Sihedron Scion, who were far more numerous and politically powerful. These Lissalan vindicators pursued the heretics and hunted them relentlessly. War of Immortals doesn't detail the fate of these Lissalan radicals, but it certainly sets the stage for a major evolution in her faith in the coming years. One last update related to the lore surrounding Lissala involves the summoning of the Oliphaunt of Jandelay by Runelord Gimmel. Magical scholars have recently developed a theory that Lissala herself taught Gimmel the powerful scrying magic which granted him a glimpse of Jandelay and its destructive power. Some scholars go so far as to theorize that Lissala's decline in power was actually a punishment imposed upon her by her fellow deities for having opened the door to Jandelay to mortals. What's especially interesting about this connection between Lissala, Gimmel, and Jandelay is the idea that if Gimmel recorded his notes on the Oliphaunt in a Lissalan temple, then that temple might resurface soon with the return of Lissala's worship to the world. Speaking of which, the Oliphaunt of Jandelay and Runelord Gimmel. During the Thassilon-Aslant War, in the early days of the Thassilonian Empire, Runelord Gimmel unleashed the mythical Oliphaunt of Jandelay, a being which is a manifestation of apocalyptic energy. The beast devastated the Aslanti armies, ending the war. Much later, during Return of the Runelords, Runelord Alasnist attempted to rewrite fate, to release the Oliphaunt upon Korvosa, though her efforts were ultimately thwarted by the heroes. While I initially covered some basics about Jandelay and the Oliphaunt last year, we've gotten a lot more new information since then. War of Immortals provided a brand new look at these topics as a potential mythic challenge for PCs to encounter, and it only seems fair to cover the latest and greatest information in this series. In the chaotic primordial soup of the early multiverse, the maelstrom crackled with energy, and this energy manifested a will. This will was a simple, unbound thing, and though it was incapable of complex thought or desire, it felt a single distinct emotion: jealousy. As existence coalesced into planets, people, and civilizations, the maelstrom grew envious of the distinctive chaotic energy which these new things could experience. This jealousy was impotent until the first planets began to die out, when the maelstrom was able to reach out and capture a sliver of this chaotic demise. The instant of this first planet's end, the moment of apocalypse, was frozen in the maelstrom, and it manifested in a pocket dimension at the heart of the chaos. This dimension became Jandelay, the realm of Armageddons. As more planets sputtered and died in the universe, their last moments were preserved within Jandelay, and the plane grew and expanded. Within Jandelay, there existed further potentiality, shapeless energy seeking a form. This energy finally took shape when the echoes of the minds and hearts of the denizens of the first dying worlds provided it with a subconscious blueprint. This energy, which was itself the very heart of Jandelay, manifested into the Oliphaunt, a towering elephantine shape of impossible proportions. The Oliphaunt was both the resident prisoner of Jandelay and somehow the force which had created it and sustains it. The beast endlessly tramples through the plane, passing over countless apocalypses. Though it contains tremendous destructive power, the Oliphaunt never leaves destruction in its wake, for the dead worlds which make up Jandelay are frozen, and the Oliphaunt, by its nature, is incapable of changing them. While the Oliphaunt itself is well known among arcane sages, the other denizens of Jandelay are far less studied. While a number of destructive beings call Jandelay home, the most powerful, beyond the Oliphaunt itself, are doubtless the mysterious Watchers. The Watchers of Jandelay are a bizarre collection of beings. They bear a single enormous eye on their head, which they focus on the edges of the various worlds which make up Jandelay's form. The Watchers construct connections between these world fragments, allowing for travel and navigation between them. The Oliphaunt takes no notice of the Watchers, even their leader, the so-called First Watcher. The First Watcher and its subordinates seek to preserve the moments of destruction which make up Jandelay, and act more protective than malevolent. Beyond the Oliphaunt and the Watchers, the most commonly encountered denizens of the plane are the Collected. These are the manifested echoes of the inhabitants of Jandelay's component worlds, the remnants of those who died in the end times of their planets. These Collected maintain the memories of the worlds they lived on, and often prove quite chatty to visitors. Unlike the Watchers, however, the Collected are terrified of the Oliphaunt, and vanish when it draws near. Famously, the Oliphaunt of Jandelay can manifest on the material plane. These manifestations sometimes occur when a powerful spellcaster completes a complicated and dangerous ritual to pull it into existence. This ritual doesn't actually allow the Oliphaunt to leave Jandelay, as its essence is tied permanently to the plane which it created. Instead, the ritual manifests only a splinter of the beast's power, unleashing a fragment of its destructive potential. Occasionally, the Oliphaunt can also manifest spontaneously. These impromptu arrivals are generally interpreted by scholars to herald one of the apocalypses which add to Jandelay, though it's unclear if the Oliphaunt's appearance is simply a warning of the end times, or if the Oliphaunt at least partially brings that end about. When the Oliphaunt appears, accompanied by the sound of blaring trumpets, it rarely manifests alone. Often a small collection of Watchers come with it. These Watchers generally keep their distance from the Oliphaunt during its rampage, instead carefully inspecting the world itself, possibly taking note of the structures they might seek to recreate in Jandelay once they return. The only wizard in Golarian's history to ever successfully summon the Oliphaunt of Jandelay was Gimmel, the third Runelord of Greed. Gimmel unleashed the Oliphaunt upon the armies of Aslant during the Thassilon-Aslant War, but failed to fully control its destructive potential. The Oliphaunt did succeed in wiping out Gimmel's Aslanti foes, but also destroyed whole armies of Thassilon's own soldiers before it was dismissed, most famously Xandergul's own Peacock legions. Though Gimmel lived a long life after the war, he was haunted by his failure to control the Oliphaunt's rampage. This obsession followed Gimmel into the afterlife, when his soul was sent to the Outer Rifts and manifested as a unique and almost deific shamisen demon. Over the millennia, Gimmel's obsession with his own failure only deepened and intensified, mutating into an all-consuming hatred of the Oliphaunt and Jandelay itself. Over centuries of research, Gimmel came to a terrifying conclusion. Jandelay was a seed, a pocket of creation preserved to be used as a foundational building block of the next iteration of the Pathfinder multiverse. Upon this discovery, Gimmel's mad rage turned apocalyptic. He now seeks to destroy Jandelay and the Oliphaunt itself, ending the cycle of destruction and recreation which keeps the multiverse running, and ensuring that when this iteration of existence ends, it will never start back up again. In this desire, he has aligned himself with the priests and divine followers of Rovagug. Gimmel himself has begun to revere the rough beast, seeing himself as a key agent of his new god, with the divine mission to ensure that Rovagug's eventual destruction of everything is permanent and unrecoverable. Liralarue, the Eighth. Warning. The following section of this video spoils a major mystery in the 7 Dooms for Sandpoint adventure path. Because 7 Dooms occurred about a year and a half before Revenge of the Runelords, some of this information is assumed to have been publicized to the world, or at least to scholars of ancient Thassilon. If you want to remain spoiler-free for that AP, stop playing this video now, or skip ahead to the outro. During the dying days of Thassilon, at the height of the Shalast-Bakrakhan War between Runelords Karzug and Alasnist, an accomplished apprentice of Karzug was promoted by her master to a managerial role in a newly constructed hub for his vast spy network. This apprentice was Liralarue, a student of greed magic. Oddly, Liralarue was notable not for her magical talent, which was at best adequate, but for her mastery over spycraft and espionage. As an editorial note, I imagine Karzug chose her not despite her lack of magical talent, but in large part because of it. Should she ever turn against him with her spies, she would lack the magical power to overthrow him. Regardless, Liralarue was tasked with the establishment of this new subterranean spy network hub near the Bakrakhan border, in a place which would someday become known as the Pit, near Sandpoint. She took to her new task with gusto, taking over management of the site in -5304 AR. She began the construction of dozens of new chambers at the site. The upper levels would serve as a barracks for the spies under her command, while the other chambers would be devoted to magical research. More on that in a moment. Liralarue herself was the picture of Thassilonian wizardry. She wore flowing robes of purple and gold, and her long brown hair, a color relatively uncommon among classical Thassilonian beauty standards, was woven into a braid. Like many practitioners of rune magic, she used a polearm in lieu of a staff, though her favored weapon was a naginata. I'm not entirely certain how she came across such a weapon, but Tian influence on Thassilonian design sensibilities is a noted phenomenon at this point. During the construction of the spyworks, Liralarue discovered a magical stone imbued with odd divinatory magic. Though she continued with her assigned task, she began to focus on this stone, and delved into a focused study of divination magic as a school. As a reminder, classical Thassilonian rune magic held that divination was separate from the other 7 schools of magic, and was unworthy of special study. During her examination of the origins of this exclusion, Liralarue learned that Zin had originally founded Thassilon on the principles of virtue rather than sin, a fact which had been obscured over the centuries by the Runelords. Rather than see the value in what Zin had attempted, however, Liralarue saw Zin's idealism as naive and foolish, and concluded that his exclusion of divination was similarly misguided. This set Liralarue upon a new path, one of subterfuge and betrayal. Publicly, she maintained her position as Karzug's spymaster. She ran his network of spies and informants successfully, earning a degree of independence from her master. This independence afforded her a level of privacy and secrecy, allowing her to pursue her new goal, to establish a new school of sin magic and ascend to the rank of Runelord. Liralarue began the construction of new chambers beneath the spyworks, levels which were unknown to her spies and agents, and were exclusive to her, her select few apprentices, and the conjured beings she summoned to her service. She began her efforts to craft a new school by retraining her transmutation specialization into a focus on divination magic. She associated this practice with a new sin, vainglory. Vainglory is the desire to be seen and acknowledged by external forces. It is similar to pride, and the two are often conflated, but is different in the fact that pride is an internal sense of ego, whereas vainglory is the desire for external validation. The sin of pride might be thought of as the opposite of the virtue of humility. The sin of vainglory, by contrast, might be thought of as the opposite of a theoretical virtue of self-confidence. For her rune of vainglory, Liralarue identified a circular symbol pierced by 7 hooks. It's unclear if the rune is naturally occurring and was a rune Liralarue observed during her spellcasting, or if she simply made it up. Narratively speaking, I think both options are equally intriguing. While all 7 of the original schools of Sin have designated fixed opposition schools, meaning schools whose spells the practitioners could not cast, Liralarue believed that divination was unique, in that practitioners would be allowed to choose any 2 opposition schools they wished. Interestingly, some of Liralarue's eventual mastery over divination resulted in the development of new powers. While it's not yet clear if there are unique school spells associated with divination, Liralarue did discover a unique magical exploit in Liralarue's Glimpse, a reaction which those who study her notes can learn to this day. As her mastery over divination grew, Liralarue sought to further advance her own power with the explicit intention of revealing herself to the world as the new 8th Runelord. She approached this goal with caution, however, knowing full well that her fellow Runelords would be quick to unite against her should she not prove powerful enough to defend herself. Still, while she remained hidden to the world, within her private lab she began to see herself as an equal to the 7 reigning Runelords, and began creating art and decor which featured her alongside them. As her own mastery over divination grew, Liralarue also began to branch out into other areas of study. It was, after all, a grand tradition among the Runelords to develop a wide variety of skills and specialities, beyond simple spellcraft. The first area into which Liralarue delved was the binding of genies from the elemental planes. She specialized in the binding of shaitans and jabali genies from the plane of Earth. These bound servants allowed her to secretly expand her research networks beneath the spyworks, without the knowledge of her subordinates. Another specialization into which Liralarue delved was the crafting of clockwork constructs. While Thassilonian and Aslanti clockwork was extremely advanced, none of the Runelords since Zin had, at least according to my research, made it an explicit area of focus, with the possible exception of Alasnist. That's a little unclear. This focus set Liralarue apart, and her expertise eventually grew, to the point that she was eventually able to construct complex clockwork beings infused with magic, which could produce and detect multi-layered sonic signals to trigger specific effects. The most famous of these was a clockwork songbird, which she built to act as the key to her secret vaults beneath the spyworks. Religiously, Liralarue was a worshipper of the pantheon of demigods who made their homes in the Outer Rifts. She worshipped the demon lords of the Rifts collectively, and didn't have a particular patron deity among them. As a part of her worship, she became a proficient demonologist, and an accomplished demon binder. She was advised by demons on a regular basis, and particularly by shadow demons. She had planned to construct a temple to the demon lords within her subterranean chambers, but never managed to complete the construction. Finally, Liralarue made a careful study of cloning, and modifications of the complicated clone ritual. This fascination was inspired by rumors of Sorshen, who was Liralarue's neighbor to the south. As part of her work as a spy, Liralarue discovered Sorshen had produced numerous clone bodies, and hidden them all around Eurythnia, as a failsafe should she ever die. Liralarue desired the same mastery over the art of cloning. In contrast to Sorshen, however, Liralarue desired to use cloning to create duplicates of powerful people, whom she could replace and control once she debuted as the Runelord of Vainglory. In pursuit of this, she even went so far as to create at least one outpost laboratory within Eurythnia's borders, risking Sorshen's fury. That said, Liralarue's pursuit of cloning was halted before she ever mastered the ritual. Liralarue's mastery over divination gave her a warning of Earthfall in the dying days of Thassilon. She received an apocalyptic vision of destruction, and it rattled her to her core. Determined to extract more detail of the impending apocalypse, she looked into the future again and again, but only ever saw further visions of decimation and doom. No matter how much she looked, she could never perceive any path by which she might survive the oncoming violence. Desperate, she embarked upon her final magical quest, to reverse engineer a rune well and create a demiplane of Vainglory into which she could escape. She worked on this exercise for weeks, possibly months, spying on Karzug and the other Runelords in an attempt to unravel the secrets they'd used to construct their rune wells. Unfortunately, for all her skill, Liralarue failed in her efforts. In the last days before the Earthfall meteor struck Golarion, she came to a devastating realization. Divination had failed her. The art of seeing the future had not given her the power to change it, or to survive the dangers she faced. Despite all her skill, her divinatory powers had done nothing but made her waste her dying days in a meaningless and doomed pursuit of survival. She might have experienced joy for the last few months of her life, but her power and arrogance had convinced her to throw her life away in a lab. When Earthfall hit, Liralarue vanished. It's unclear if she was killed, or managed to find some other means of survival beyond her failed rune well. Because of the isolation which she imposed upon herself in the name of security, her works languished in obscurity for millennia, only recently coming to light when adventurers exploring the pit outside of Sandpoint unearthed the many secrets she left behind. Well, that's it. That's all I've got. I have covered the history of Thassilon. If you've watched the entirety of the SinMas series, congratulations. You are now an unofficial expert on Thassilonian history and lore. You are as prepared as I can possibly make you for Revenge of the Runelords, the culmination of 18 years of storytelling by Paizo. This last video in this series was like a trip back in time to 2024 for me, since this was the video from this year which required the most research and the synthesis of multiple sources of information. It was fun to really get back into the research paper mindset, but I'm also glad my videos for this year were a lot easier to make. Next week, the Merry Little SinMas series will conclude with my highly anticipated video player's guide for Revenge of the Runelords. I say highly anticipated because, regardless of how y'all feel about it, I am looking forward to being done with it, because that means I can finally play Ghost of Yote, which has been sitting in its shrink wrap on my PlayStation since early October. It's still there as I write this, taunting me, calling me with its samurai siren song. Anyway, tune in next week on January 2nd for the final video in this series. Thanks for watching, and I wish you all a Merry Little SinMas.